Welcome to the presentation on cycles of matter. Today we're going to talk about the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle, and how those three substances, water, carbon, and nitrogen, keep cycling through the environment to help animals and organisms stay alive. Without water, there'd be no life on Earth. This is why astronomers and scientists search for water on places like the Moon and Mars as spots that we might recolonize or send out people to in the future. All organisms, from bacteria to animals and plants, are composed mostly of water, and we use it to transport waste and nutrients both in plants and organisms. Plants use sap to move nutrients from the soil up into their leaves. Humans use blood to move wastes and nutrients around. Water is also super helpful to regulate the temperature of an organism, whether that's because water is slow to change its temperature, and so it helps to maintain a more constant temperature in most organisms. And all water organisms use is eventually returned to the environment, whether that is through giving it off as wastes or water vapor as we exhale, or through when an organism dies that it desiccates and dries out. So some terms to know: transpiration. Transpiration is the process of plants releasing a large amount of water during photosynthesis and respiration. We talked about this during the photosynthesis and respiration presentation, that water is released through the stomata, which is why they close at night to help save the plant some water. But naturally, water vapor escapes from the leaves through the stomata. Evaporation is the changing of water from a liquid to a vapor, or from a liquid to a gas. Condensation is the opposite. When water vapor cools, the gas returns to a liquid state. Precipitation is when any form of water falls to the Earth's surface from clouds, and that could be rain, it could be sleet, it could be hail, it could be snow. Any form of water coming from clouds to the Earth's surface is precipitation. Runoff is precipitation that falls on land and flows into streams, rivers, and lakes. So if it's water that's traveling across the surface of the Earth, that is runoff, where if it goes into the Earth, that becomes groundwater. That's precipitation that seeps into the ground and is stored in the spaces between or within rocks. So some other facts to know as we look at the water cycle: 97.5% of the water on Earth is seawater. Only 2.5% is fresh water. So that means that the majority of our planet is seawater out here in the oceans. So that seawater can be evaporated. That's the changing from a liquid to a gas, and becomes water vapor that rises up and forms clouds when it condenses from a gas back to a liquid form. So clouds are made of water droplets that are in liquid form up in the air. And so that is clouds, and they can transport for a long ways around the planet. And then when those water droplets get big enough, they will fall as precipitation back to the Earth. And a lot of that falls into our oceans, kind of creating a little cycle in our oceans of evaporation, precipitation, collection, around and around. So remembering that only 2.5% of water on the Earth is fresh water. Of that 2.5%, only 0.3% is found in rivers and lakes. So that's not a lot of water on our planet is actually fresh water that we can use. 30% of the water, fresh water on Earth, so this is 30% of that 2.5%, is stored in groundwater aquifers. That would be under the ground. You will find 30% of the fresh water on our planet. And 70% is stored as glaciers, ice, and permafrost. So the 70% of our water isn't usable to us. So the water cycle is super important. Some other things that happen in the water cycle is transpiration from plants that we talked about, that plants give off water vapor. So when you have things like a tropical rainforest, you're actually getting a lot of water given off as water vapor from those plants in the tropical rainforest to help form clouds. Also, another way that water gets into the air is through sublimation. Sublimation is when water goes from a solid directly to water vapor. So think of snow in the winter in Utah. We have a really dry climate, and dry climates are better for sublimation than moist climates. The water will actually evaporate directly out of the snow. So going from a solid to a vapor is called sublimation. And then water running off over the surface can fill up lakes and rivers, and then it can evaporate back, or it can infiltrate back into groundwater, and water can flow through the ground. It's really a cool process. Not all rock is solid. Some of it is sort of like a sponge that you can get water to go through, and so groundwater is really cool to help that. So average time through the water cycle for some of these things. In living organisms, a water molecule is typically there on average of 1 week. In the atmosphere, so as clouds, those last an average of 1.5 weeks or 1.5 weeks. Water molecules flowing through rivers typically do it in an average of 2 weeks. If it's in soil moisture, that can be anywhere from 2 weeks to a year. In lakes and reservoirs, water spends an average of 10 years there. In our oceans, a water molecule spends an average of 4,000 years there. And as groundwater, so in the water table and in aquifers, it could be there anywhere from 2 weeks to 10,000 years. So there are some freshwater springs that water can be thousands of years old flowing out of that spring. And then as glaciers and permafrost, those can last 1 to 10,000 years. So water can spend a long time in the water cycle, but ultimately it just kind of keeps getting recycled and moved around, and it can do it fairly quickly or it can do it fairly slowly depending on where the water molecules end up. The carbon cycle. So besides water, the most common molecules in living things are organic molecules, or molecules that contain carbon. So carbon is considered the backbone of life, especially here on Earth, and humans are 18 to 19% carbon by mass. So when you look at your weight, 18 to 19% of what you weigh is just carbon atoms. So photosynthesis and respiration are the basis of the carbon cycle. It's part of the quick form of the carbon cycle. Plants use carbon dioxide from the air to make sugars, and then carbon dioxide returns to the environment when sugar molecules are broken down to release energy in respiration. Decomposition also returns carbon dioxide to the environment, and that's when substances are broken down into simpler molecules. Fungi and bacteria are two of our primary decomposing organisms or groups of organisms that help return the carbon dioxide and water to the environment. Another way to return carbon dioxide to the environment is through the process of combustion, and that's when you burn things. So when you burn organic matter, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This can happen from things like forest fires or burning a campfire, or it can be the burning of fossil fuels, including but not limited to coal, oil, and natural gas. Burning those things, such as driving your car, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So when we look at the carbon cycle, we have kind of a short little cycle here where things spend a short amount of time in each part of the carbon cycle. Photosynthesis traps carbon in sugars, and then when organisms such as bunnies eat the sugars, they then release that carbon as respiration and carbon dioxide gas. Carbon dioxide gas actually only makes up 0.04% of our atmospheric gases. So it's a really small component in our atmosphere. There is also a bigger cycle kind of around this whole thing too, where carbon can be trapped in fossil fuels. So there's coal, natural gas, and oil deposits deep in the ground that formed millions of years ago. And when we burn those things as humans, we release carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Also, we have that same respiration photosynthesis quick cycle in the oceans with photosynthesizers in the ocean, including phytoplankton and marine plants. And then all marine organisms do respiration, burning the glucose to have energy and giving off carbon dioxide. But some organisms, such as hard-shelled organisms that live in the ocean, when they die, they settle to the bottom and you get a layer of sediments on the bottom of the oceans that over time will develop into limestone. And limestone is one of the biggest carbon storage places on our planet. And then as plants and swamps die and decay and get broken down, they will also over millions of years turn into things like coal, oil, and natural gas as well. Some carbon is also given off by volcanic eruption. So carbon cycles around quite a bit through our biosphere so that all organisms get a chance to have carbon. So the nitrogen cycle. Organisms need nitrogen to build proteins and DNA for new cells. Without nitrogen, things wouldn't happen. Nitrogen is typically the limiting factor for plant growth. It's why you can go to garden stores and find bags of fertilizer that are high in nitrogen. And shockingly, 78% of the Earth's atmosphere is nitrogen gas. Most of what you breathe in is nitrogen gas. But most organisms can't use nitrogen gas directly. You and I can't use that nitrogen that's bound up as an N2 molecule. But bacteria in the soil can change nitrogen gas into forms that plants can use, and this is called nitrogen fixation. Other organisms get nitrogen by eating plants or eating organisms that eat plants. So you and I get the nitrogen we need by eating plants or eating some animals that eat plants. Once again, decomposers play a role in this cycle as well, as they release a form of nitrogen into the soil that plants can use and break down nitrogen in dead organisms. And also, certain types of bacteria in the soil convert nitrogen into gas, which is returned to the atmosphere, so that we are not just slowly pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere and eventually there wouldn't be any, but some bacteria return the nitrogen gas to the atmosphere as well. Simplified model, this is what it looks like. That we have atmospheric nitrogen, and nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert N2 into ammonia, which is NH3, and some plants can use that. And then some nitrifying bacteria also convert the ammonia into nitrates and nitrites that other plants can use. And then denitrifying bacteria convert the nitrates back to N2 and release it back into the atmosphere. So bacteria play a huge role in this nitrogen cycle, switching nitrogen into a form plants can use so that then humans can then eat the plants or eat organisms that eat the plants to get nitrogen. And bacteria also play a role in returning nitrogen gas back to the atmosphere. So all of that helps us get those nutrients that we need. Nitrogen is present in DNA, and DNA would not exist without nitrogen. So here's how it looks on a bigger scale. Nitrogen fixation by bacteria. There's wastes in the soils, and then plants use it, and then it goes into the food webs and gets consumed and put back into wastes in the soils and modified like the previous one. The bacteria releases nitrogen gas back into the atmosphere, both on land and in the ocean. And then there's also a little thing over here. So humans realized that nitrogen was important for plants to grow, and that it was a limiting factor, meaning that if you leave plants as they are, they grow to a certain height, and if you add nitrogen to the soil, they grow bigger. So we figured out an industrial way to increase nitrogen in the soil, so we added fertilizers. And those fertilizers, when applied to crops, will help them grow more so we can feed the more than 7 billion humans on our planet. But some of that fertilizer runs off, and it can go into the ocean or into lakes and rivers, and it can affect the food webs there both in a positive and negative way. But we have found a way to add nitrogen into this cycle as well. And that is the nitrogen cycle.